So glad you're back. I've got a crazy tale for you today.
Sienna Thorne laughed as she flicked a glob of beluga caviar onto Elena Thorne's faded blazer in front of the city's top art collectors. The dark, salty beads clung to the lapel of the cheap polyester, a stark contrast to the shimmering champagne silk of Sienna's own designer gown. The sound of the laughter was sharp, cutting through the low hum of the Metropolitan Gallery's gala like a serrated blade. "Oh, Elena," Sienna said, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of a nearby duchess and two hedge fund titans. "I'm so sorry. I forgot that for some people, a dry cleaning bill is a major life event. Maybe you can just dab it off with a paper towel in the servants' quarters." Elena Thorne didn't flinch. She felt the cold moisture of the caviar seeping into the fabric, but her gaze remained steady. She looked at her sister, the woman whose face was currently plastered across 3 million Instagram feeds, and then at the sapphire brooch pinned to Sienna's chest. The gems caught the gallery's recessed lighting, throwing deep blue sparks against the white silk. It was their grandmother's brooch, a piece of Thorne history that had been promised to Elena on the old woman's deathbed. 2 weeks after the funeral, it had simply vanished from Elena's bedside table. Now it sat as a trophy on the woman who had spent the last decade treating Elena like a stray dog she'd forgotten to feed. "It's fine," Elena said, her voice a calm, low vibration. "The blazer is old. It's seen worse than a bit of fish eggs." "Clearly," Sienna sneered, leaning in so the scent of her cloying $500 an ounce perfume filled Elena's lungs. "Everything about you is old, Elena. You smell like dust and turpentine. Honestly, why you insisted on coming tonight is beyond me. You're the restorer, not the artist. You're the help. You should be in the back with the mops, not out here ruining the aesthetic." Marcus Thorne stepped forward then, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke tuxedo. He didn't look at Elena. He never did when Sienna was in the room. He reached out and draped an arm around his favorite daughter's shoulders, beaming with a pride he had never once directed at his eldest child. "Now, Sienna, don't be cruel," Marcus said, though his tone was light, indulgent. "Your sister worked very hard on the Renaissance piece. Someone has to do the tedious scrubbing so you can be the face of the Thorne legacy." He finally spared a glance at Elena, his lip curling slightly at the sight of the caviar stain. "Though, Elena, your sister is right about the attire. It's a bit embarrassing. Try to stay in the shadows, will you? We have investors to impress." Clara Thorne stood a few feet away, her hands clutching a crystal flute of vintage Krug so tightly her knuckles were white. She met Elena's eyes for a fleeting second, a flicker of something that might have been regret crossing her face, before she looked away, smoothing her hair and nodding at a passing socialite. She was a witness, as she always was, silent and complicit in the erasure of her firstborn. Elena felt a familiar heat rising in her chest, but it wasn't the heat of tears. It was the slow, steady burn of a fuse. She reached into her pocket and felt the cool, hard edge of her phone. It buzzed once, a private notification from an encrypted line. "The acquisition is complete. You now hold 51% of the Vane Thorne Holding Group. Say the word." Elena took a slow breath, the scent of the expensive lilies in the foyer suddenly smelling like victory. She looked past her father's shoulder to where Julian Vane stood near the entrance. The tech billionaire was the most powerful man in the room, a shark in a sea of goldfish, and he was watching her with a singular, focused intensity. When she gave the smallest, nearly imperceptible nod, he raised his glass to her. "I'll stay out of the way, father," Elena said, her voice devoid of the hurt they expected. "I wouldn't want to ruin the surprise." Sienna rolled her eyes, already turning her back to greet a photographer. "Good. Go find a corner to hide in, and for heaven's sake, take that blazer off. You look like a charity case." Elena turned and walked toward the darkened hallway that led to the restoration labs. Behind her, she heard the pop of another champagne cork and Sienna's shrill, performative giggle. The sound of her sister's heels on the marble floor was rhythmic, arrogant, the sound of someone who believed the floor would always be there to catch her. Once inside the quiet of the lab, Elena stripped off the stained blazer and tossed it into the trash bin. Beneath it, she wore a simple black silk camisole that cost more than Sienna's entire outfit, though no one in that room had the eye to recognize the quality of the weave. She pulled her phone out and tapped a single command into the interface. The gala was scheduled to last another 3 hours. The auction for the centerpiece, the very painting Elena had spent 6 months restoring, would begin in 60 minutes. Sienna planned to take the stage and announce a major Thorne family donation, a move designed to cement her status as the city's leading philanthropist. Elena watched the screen as the confirmation light turned green. She thought about the brooch on Sienna's chest. She thought about the caviar on her blazer. She thought about the way her mother had looked away. "Julian," Elena said when the call connected. Her voice was ice, the sound of a sleeping lion finally opening its eyes. "The auction. I want the announcement made the moment she touches the microphone, not a second before. And the brooch?" Julian's voice was a low, smooth baritone on the other end. "Let her wear it for now," Elena said, looking at her own reflection in the darkened glass of the lab window. "I want it to be the last thing she loses when the lights go out." She hung up and checked the time. 59 minutes until the Thorne family legacy began to burn. 59 minutes until Sienna realized that the sister she had spent a lifetime stepping on was the one who owned the ground beneath her feet. Elena picked up a scalpel from her workbench, the steel gleaming under the fluorescent lights, and began to wait. The next morning, the Thorne estate was a hive of frantic, expensive energy. Elena Thorne entered the sun-drenched breakfast room to the sharp, rhythmic clinking of a silver spoon against fine bone china. Sienna sat at the head of the table, her silk robe shimmering like oil on water under the massive crystal chandelier. She didn't look up. She was too busy admiring the stolen emerald brooch pinned to the lapel of her robe, her thumb tracing the gold filigree Elena had spent 3 months meticulously restoring in her private time. "There you are," Sienna said, finally glancing up with a thin, practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I need you to look at my gown for tonight. There's a loose thread on the bodice, right near the waist. A nobody like you is good at those tiny, tedious things, right? It's basically what you do at that dusty museum anyway." The audacity was a physical weight in the room, thick as the scent of the lilies Clara had arranged in the center of the table. Marcus Thorne sat at the other end of the long marble surface, buried in the financial section of the morning paper. He didn't look at his eldest daughter. To him, Elena was merely the background noise to Sienna's rising symphony. "I have work at the lab," Elena said, her voice a calm, steady anchor against her sister's turbulence. She reached for the coffee carafe, the steam warming her face as the scent of dark Arabica filled her senses. "The lab," Marcus lowered his paper, his eyes hard and dismissive. "Elena, your sister is about to save this family's reputation at the Julian Vane auction tonight. The least you can do is make sure she looks the part. Stop being so bitter about her success. It's unbecoming of a Thorne." Sienna smirked, reaching for a croissant with a delicate, manicured hand. "It's not her fault, Dad. Some people are born to be in the spotlight, and others are born to fix the stage. Just do the dress, Elena. I'll even let you stand in the back of the gallery tonight so you can watch me accept the donation award. It'll be the highlight of your year." Elena felt the sharp vibration of her phone in her pocket. She didn't need to look at it to know it was the confirmation she'd been waiting for. She took a slow sip of her black coffee, letting the bitterness coat her tongue. "I'll look at the dress, Sienna," she said quietly. She caught her own reflection in the polished silver coffee urn, the sleeping lion Julian had described. "I'll make sure every single thread is exactly where it needs to be when the lights go up." "Good." Sienna stood, her perfume, something cloyingly sweet and aggressively expensive, trailing behind her like a toxic cloud. "And don't wear that gray cardigan tonight. You look like a librarian. Try to find something that doesn't scream disappointment for once." She swept out of the room, her light, mocking laughter echoing down the marble hallway. Marcus followed her, already barking orders into his phone about the evening's press coverage and the expected valuation of the Thorne collection. Clara paused by the door, finally meeting Elena's gaze. There was a flicker of something, perhaps a ghost of maternal guilt, but it was quickly extinguished by the glint of the diamond earrings Marcus had bought her with credit they no longer actually possessed. "Just try to be happy for her, Elena," Clara whispered before disappearing after the others. Elena stood alone in the silence of the room. She pulled her phone from her pocket and looked at the message from Julian Vane. "The acquisition of the Thorne debt portfolio is finalized. You are now the primary lien holder for the estate and the auction house. They are walking into your building tonight." Elena looked at the clock on the wall. 9 hours. In 9 hours, Sienna would step onto that stage wearing a stolen brooch and a stolen reputation, looking out into a crowd of the city's elite while expecting a standing ovation. Elena set her coffee cup down with a precise, final click. She wasn't going to fix a dress. She was preparing a shroud. The countdown had begun, and as she checked the digital timer on her screen, she realized that Sienna had no idea the ground she was walking on already belonged to the sister she had just dismissed. 2 days later, the sterile, metallic scent of the high-security vault at Vane Holdings felt more like home to Elena than her father's house ever had. She stood before a mahogany table, her eyes fixed on the thick stack of legal documents Julian Vane had just placed there. The paper felt heavy, the ink of the signatures fresh and sharp. These weren't just debts. They were the keys to the Thorne kingdom, and every single one of them now bore her name. Julian leaned against the cold steel of the vault door, his arms crossed. "The transition is seamless, Elena. Your father's creditors were more than happy to sell. They didn't care who held the leash as long as they got paid." He gestured to the folder. "As of 9 o'clock this morning, you own the mortgage on the estate, the lease on the auction house, and every piece of inventory currently sitting in their showroom, including the items Sienna thinks she's borrowing for the gala." Elena traced the embossed seal on the top page. The texture was rough under her fingertip, a physical reminder of the power she had spent a decade building in the shadows. "And the brooch." "The insurance records were the easiest part to flip," Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial tone. "The Thorne heirloom is officially listed as stolen in the national database. If anyone tries to authenticate the piece Sienna is wearing tonight, the system will flag it as a felony possession within seconds." The sharp vibration of a phone against the mahogany table cut through the silence. Elena glanced down. The caller ID displayed a crown emoji, Sienna's self-assigned contact name. Elena let it ring for 3 long seconds before answering. "Where are you?" Sienna's voice shrieked through the speaker, high-pitched and vibrating with unearned authority. "I've been calling for 20 minutes. The clasp on the brooch is sticking, and I need you at the house now to polish the settings. I can't have it looking dull under the ballroom lights." Elena kept her voice flat, the perfect mask of the dutiful, overlooked sister. "I'm finishing a project, Sienna. I'll be there when I can." "Your projects don't matter," Sienna snapped. The sound of a designer heel clicking impatiently against marble echoed in the background. "Do you have any idea who is going to be at this gala? The governor, the Vanes, the entire board of the Met. This is my moment to solidify the Thorne brand. You're lucky I'm even letting you attend as my assistant. The least you can do is make sure I look like the legacy I am." "A legacy," Elena repeated softly, her eyes meeting Julian's. He offered a grim, knowing smile. "I understand perfectly, Sienna. I'll make sure everything is exactly as it should be." "Good, and don't wear that pathetic gray sweater. Try to find something that doesn't scream charity case. It reflects poorly on me." The line went dead with a dismissive click. Elena set the phone down. The rage was there, a familiar, cold simmer in her chest, but it was tempered now by the weight of the folder in front of her. Sienna's arrogance wasn't just a personality trait anymore. It was the blindfold she had tied over her own eyes. "She really has no idea, does she?" Julian asked, stepping closer to the table. "Sienna has never looked at me and seen a person," Elena said, her voice steady. "She sees a tool, a shadow, something to be used and then stepped on." She picked up a small, velvet-lined box from the corner of the table and opened it. Inside, resting on a bed of black silk, was the real Thorne brooch, the one Elena had swapped for a near-perfect forgery weeks ago. The diamonds caught the overhead light, throwing fractured rainbows against the vault walls. She thinks she's wearing the crown jewel. She doesn't realize she's parading a fake, while the real weight of the family name is sitting in my hand. The door to the vault hummed as it began to cycle shut, the heavy gears grinding with a sound like a closing tomb. Elena tucked the real brooch into her pocket and picked up the debt portfolio. Before she could leave, her phone buzzed again. This time it was Marcus. "Elena," her father began, his voice sounding thin and strained. "I hope you finished that dress for your sister. She's very stressed about tonight. This gala is our last chance to secure the investors we need to keep the auction house afloat. If Sienna makes the right impression, we might just survive the quarter. Is that all I am to you, Dad? A seamstress for Sienna's success?" There was a long, uncomfortable pause on the other end. "Don't be difficult, Elena. You know how the world works. Sienna has the image. She has the following. We all have to play our parts to keep the family together. Just do this for us. One last time." "Oh, I'm doing it for the family, Dad," Elena said, her thumb brushing the edge of the document that proved she now owned his bedroom. "I'm doing exactly what needs to be done." She hung up before he could respond. The betrayal no longer stung. It only clarified her purpose. Marcus and Clara had spent years sacrificing Elena on the altar of Sienna's vanity, never realizing they were feeding a fire that was eventually going to consume them all. Julian walked her to the elevator, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder. "Everything is in place. The guest list, the media, the legal team. Detective Miller is already briefed on the stolen property report. He'll be in the crowd, waiting for the signal." Elena stepped into the elevator and turned to face him. The doors began to slide shut, reflecting her own image back at her, calm, composed, and utterly lethal. 24 hours, Elena whispered as the lift began its descent. 24 hours until the Thorne name stopped being a shield for her sister and started being a noose. The countdown had reached its final cycle, and for the first time in her life, Elena wasn't afraid of the fall. She was the one who owned the ground. The morning before the Thorne charity gala, the estate was a chaotic hive of performative elegance. Elena stood on the second-floor landing, watching the transformation of the foyer below. The air was thick with the cloying, artificial scent of expensive hairspray and the sharp, earthy odor of thousands of imported lilies that Sienna had insisted be replaced twice already. Downstairs, Sienna Thorne was in the center of the storm, her voice rising in a familiar, jagged pitch. She was berating a young caterer, whose only crime was suggesting that the champagne towers be moved 6 inches to the left. "Do you have any idea whose event this is?" Sienna snapped, her designer heels clicking like gunfire against the cold marble floor. She didn't wait for an answer, turning instead to her reflection in a gold-leaf mirror. "This is my relaunch. If the lighting doesn't hit the label on the bottles exactly right, your entire company will be blacklisted before the first toast is poured." Elena felt the weight of the silver folder in her hand, a cold, thin slab of retribution. Inside were the forensic audits Julian had finalized at dawn, proving that every cent of Sienna's influencer empire was built on a foundation of their father's embezzled client funds and Elena's own stolen restoration commissions. She began to descend the stairs, her movements quiet and deliberate. She saw Marcus Thorne enter from the garden, his face flushed with the kind of frantic energy that only comes from a man who knows his house of cards is trembling. He didn't look at the staff. He looked only at Sienna, his eyes filled with the desperate adoration of a man who had bet his last shred of dignity on the wrong child. "Elena, move," Marcus muttered as he brushed past her on the stairs, not even offering a glance. "You're blocking the light for the photographer's walkthrough. Go help your mother with the seating charts in the back. Try to be useful for once." The dismissal was a familiar sting, but today it felt like a gift. It was the final confirmation that no bridge remained to be burned. "I was actually looking for Sienna," Elena said, her voice a calm, low anchor in the middle of the noise. Sienna turned, her eyes narrowed. She looked at Elena's simple navy dress with a sneer that had been practiced since childhood. "If you're here to ask for a loan again, don't. I've already told the bookkeeper that your allowance is suspended until after the gala. I have an image to maintain, and a sister who looks like a librarian doesn't fit the brand. A few of the nearby decorators stifled smirks. Elena didn't flinch. She stepped closer, stepping into Sienna's personal space until the smell of her sister's perfume, something heavy and suffocatingly sweet, became an assault. "I'm not here for money, Sienna," Elena whispered, loud enough only for her sister to hear. "I'm here to give you a piece of advice. You should check the serial numbers on the sapphire set you're planning to wear tomorrow. The ones you reported lost to the insurance company 3 months ago." The color didn't leave Sienna's face immediately. Instead, her expression hardened into a mask of pure, entitled rage. She leaned in, her voice a venomous hiss. "I don't know what you think you saw, but those jewels are mine. Dad gave them to me because I'm the one who actually brings value to this name. You're just the help who happens to share our blood. If you mention that insurance claim again, I'll have you removed from this house tonight. Do you understand?" Elena smiled, a slow, thin curve of the lips that didn't reach her eyes. "I understand perfectly. I just thought you'd want to know that some things are better left in the dark. Once the lights go up tomorrow, there's no going back." "Get out," Sienna spat, turning back to her mirror. "Go hide in your workroom. Tomorrow is my night, and you are nothing but a footnote." Elena turned and walked toward the library, her steps echoing with a finality that no one else in the room could hear. She felt the vibration of her phone in her pocket. A text from Julian. "The media links are live. Detective Miller is confirmed for the 8:00 p.m. arrival. The trap is set." She looked back one last time at the foyer, at her father laughing with a donor and her sister preening for a camera that wasn't even on yet. They were so blinded by the glare of their own perceived brilliance that they couldn't see the shadows closing in. Elena retreated into the quiet of the library, the countdown in her head ticking toward the first second of the rest of their lives. She had given the warning. Now, she only had to wait for the sun to set on the Thorne legacy. The evening of the Thorne Foundation Gala arrived with a suffocating sense of expectation. By 7 o'clock, the estate had been transformed into a glittering cathedral of glass and light, designed for the sole purpose of canonizing a lie. Elena stood on the periphery of the grand ballroom, her modest navy dress a stark contrast to the sea of sequins and designer labels. She watched the elite of the city drift through the space, their laughter tinkling like the expensive crystal they held. The air was thick with the scent of white lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of vintage champagne, a combination that usually signaled triumph for her family. Tonight, it smelled like a wake. Sienna was already at the center of the room, vibrating with a manic, performative energy. She wore a gown of liquid gold that seemed to catch every photon from the chandeliers, her hair styled into a crown that demanded subservience. She was holding court with a group of high-profile donors, her hands gesturing wildly as she described the spiritual exhaustion of her latest restoration project. "It's not just about the paint," Sienna's voice carried over the crowd, dripping with a practiced, breathy sincerity. "It's about breathing life back into a dying soul. I spent weeks in the dark with this piece, whispering to it." Elena felt a cold ripple of disgust. She took a slow breath, her fingers brushing the small, hard shape of the encrypted drive tucked into her clutch. The secret power of it was a steadying weight. She wasn't just a guest, she was the architect of the collapse. "Elena, there you are." Marcus Thorne approached, his tuxedo fit for a king, but his eyes darting around the room to ensure no one important saw him talking to his less marketable daughter. He didn't look at her, he looked past her toward a senator entering the foyer. "Try to stay near the catering entrance, would you? We need the floor clear for the photographers when the auction begins. And for heaven's sake, put that drink down. You look like you're loitering." "I'm just taking it all in, Father," she replied, her voice level. "It's a night we'll all remember." Marcus grunted, adjusting his silk cufflinks. "See that you don't ruin it. Sienna has worked too hard to have your drabness, dampening the mood. Tonight is about the Thorne legacy. Try to act like you belong to it, even if you don't contribute to it." He walked away without waiting for a response, his path leading straight to Sienna, whom he embraced with a theatrical warmth that made the photographer's flashes erupt. Clara stood nearby, her expression a mask of brittle pride, though her eyes occasionally flickered toward Elena with a shadow of something that might have been guilt, if Clara were capable of feeling it. The sound of the ballroom doors opening wider announced the arrival of Julian Vane. He moved through the crowd with the effortless authority of a man who didn't need to shout to be heard. When his gaze found Elena's, he gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The trap was armed. "The guest of honor has arrived," Julian said, stepping into the circle around the Thorne family. His voice was smooth, but Elena heard the edge of the blade beneath it. "Marcus, Clara, and the visionary herself." "Sienna, the art world is buzzing about what's under that silk veil." Sienna beamed, placing a hand on Julian's arm with an ownership that made Elena's skin crawl. "Oh, Julian, you always knew I had this in me, even when others," she spared a disparaging glance toward Elena, "tried to hold me back with their small-minded rules." "Rules are what keep the world from falling apart," Julian remarked, his smile not reaching his eyes. He turned to Elena. "Don't you agree, Elena?" "I think the truth does a better job of that," she said quietly. Sienna laughed, a sharp, jagged sound. "Truth is for people who can't afford a better story. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a masterpiece to sell. Elena, darling, be a love and tell the staff to bring more of the Krug to the VIP table. You seem to have a natural rapport with the service industry." Elena watched her sister stride toward the velvet-draped stage at the front of the room. The arrogance in Sienna's walk was peak level, the stride of a woman who believed she had finally buried her competition under a mountain of gold. Elena moved toward the back of the room, finding a shadow near the audio-visual booth. She checked her watch. 7:55 p.m. The media links Julian had seeded were already trending in the private circles of the city's most influential collectors. The countdown was no longer in days or hours, but in minutes. She could feel the vibration of the room, the anticipation of the crowd, the frantic heartbeat of a legacy about to flatline. Detective Miller entered through the main doors, his plain suit a jarring anomaly among the tuxedos. He didn't head for the bar. He moved to the side of the room, his eyes locked on the stage. Elena felt a surge of adrenaline that tasted like ozone. Sienna stepped onto the podium, the spotlight hitting her gold dress and turning her into a blinding statue of vanity. She tapped the microphone, the sound echoing through the ballroom like a gavel. The room went silent. Every head turned. Every witness was in place. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sienna began, her voice amplified and echoing off the marble walls. "Tonight, you aren't just bidding on a painting. You are bidding on a piece of history that I personally rescued from the shadows. This restoration is my gift to the world." She reached for the cord of the silk veil. Elena gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "Wait for it," she whispered to the empty air. As Sienna's hand tightened on the fabric, ready to reveal the work she had stolen and claimed as her own, the massive digital screens flanking the stage flickered. They didn't show the promotional video of Sienna in her studio. Instead, a grainy, high-definition timestamp appeared, dated 3 weeks ago. Sienna pulled the veil, revealing the shimmering canvas, but the crowd wasn't looking at the art. They were looking at the screens, where a hidden camera showed Elena Thorne standing over the same canvas, holding a glass of red wine, and laughing as she told someone off camera, "It doesn't matter if the brushwork is hers. The name on the check will be mine." The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the room. Sienna stood frozen, her hand still clutching the silk, her smile beginning to fracture as she realized the eyes of the room were no longer filled with admiration, but with a dawning, horrified recognition. Elena stepped out of the shadows, the cold weight of the truth finally ready to drop. The silence in the Thorne gallery was a physical weight, thick with the scent of white lilies and the sharp ozone of a dying reputation. Sienna stood paralyzed beneath the flickering glow of the projector, the silk of the stolen veil still clutched in her trembling hand. On the screens surrounding the room, The grainy loop of her own voice played again, a digital ghost admitting to a lifetime of intellectual theft. "It's a deep fake," Sienna rasped, her voice cracking like dry parchment. She looked around the room, her eyes darting toward the wealthy patrons who had, moments ago, been her worshippers. "Elena, tell them this is a joke, a performance piece for the opening." Elena stepped into the center of the light, her movements fluid and agonizingly calm. She wore a simple, midnight blue dress that draped with a weight only true silk possessed. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. The authority in her stride spoke for her, drawing every eye in the room away from the frantic woman on the stage. Sienna's face underwent a violent transformation. The practiced porcelain mask of the Thorne heiress didn't just crack, it disintegrated. Her skin, usually glowing with high-end serum, turned a sickly, bruised shade of gray. Her lower lip trembled with a frantic, rhythmic twitch that she couldn't suppress, and her eyes, usually so sharp and calculating, became wide, glassy orbs of pure, unadulterated panic. She looked small, suddenly, as if the air had been sucked out of her lungs, her chest heaving in shallow, ragged bursts that made the diamonds at her throat catch the light in a jagged, frantic dance. The arrogance that had been her armor for years was stripped away, leaving behind a hollow, terrified girl who realized, too late, that the pedestal she stood on was made of glass. "It isn't a performance, Sienna," Elena said, her voice a cool blade cutting through the humid air. "It's a deposition." Marcus Thorne took a step forward from the front row, his face a mottled purple, his fingers digging into the silver head of his cane until his knuckles turned white. "Elena, stop this madness. Think of the family name. Think of what you're doing to your sister." "I am thinking of it, Father," Elena replied, not even turning to look at him. "I'm thinking of how you let her sell my soul to pay for your gambling debts." Clara Thorne let out a soft, broken sob, her hand flying to her mouth as she backed away from Sienna as if her favorite daughter had suddenly become infectious. Beside her, a prominent art critic, a woman who had once called Sienna the voice of a generation, let her exhibition program flutter to the floor. She stepped back, her heels clicking sharply on the marble, the sound echoing like a gavel. The social distance was already growing. The elite were instinctually insulating themselves from the coming blast. Julian Vane moved from the shadows near the bar, holding a thick leather folder. He didn't say a word, but the way he stood beside Elena sent a shockwave through the room. The alliance was clear. The tech giant wasn't here for the art, he was the architect of the trap. "You said I was the help, Sienna," Elena said, stepping closer until she was inches away from her sister. She could smell the expensive, cloying perfume Sienna used to mask her insecurities, now mixed with the sharp, acidic scent of cold sweat. "You told me I didn't belong in rooms like this, that I was lucky you let me breathe your air." Sienna tried to speak, but her throat seemed to have closed. She looked at the crowd, searching for a single friendly face, but found only the cold, judgmental stares of the people she had lied to. Elena reached into the folder Julian held and pulled out a single, notarized document. She held it up so the front row could see the gold seal of the state registry. "This isn't just about the paintings," Elena announced, her voice projecting to the very back of the hall. "Sienna, you've been living in a house built on my labor. This gallery, it's registered in my name. The Thorne Trust, I bought out the majority shares 6 months ago. You don't own the art, you don't own this building, and as of 5 minutes ago, you don't even own the car you parked out front." The room erupted into a frantic hive of whispers. Detective Miller stepped through the double doors at the back, his trench coat a stark contrast to the tuxedos. He didn't move toward Elena, he moved toward the stage. "I told you the truth would have a price," Elena whispered, leaning in so only her sister could hear. "I hope the fame was worth the bankruptcy." Elena turned on her heel, the fabric of her dress whispering against the floor. She didn't look back at her father's pleas or her sister's collapse. She walked out of the gallery and into the cool night air, leaving the wreckage of the Thorne legacy behind her. Behind her, the first sirens began to wail, cutting through the silence of the street. Elena stood on the rain-slicked sidewalk, the biting wind of the city night cutting through her silk dress, but she didn't feel the cold. Behind the floor-to-ceiling glass of the gallery, the world she had been cast out of was imploding in silent, rhythmic pulses of blue and red light. The sirens were a discordant symphony, drowning out the high society chatter that had defined her life for 28 years. She watched as Detective Miller placed a heavy, gloved hand on the mahogany podium, his presence an oily smudge on the pristine white aesthetic of the room. Inside, Sienna Thorne was a whirlwind of frantic, ugly motion. She lunged for the stack of documents Elena had left on the stage, her manicured nails clawing at the heavy bond paper as if she could shred the truth into non-existence. She was screaming. Elena couldn't hear the words through the soundproof glass, but the jagged shape of her sister's mouth told the story. Sienna turned toward the crowd, her hands outspread in a desperate, theatrical plea, but the audience of elite donors and critics was already recoiling. Sienna's face didn't just fall, it disintegrated. The carefully curated mask of the Thorne heiress, the one she had spent a decade painting with expensive serums and practiced smirks, shattered into 1,000 jagged shards of panic. Her skin, usually glowing with the artificial radiance of $1,000 facial, turned a sickly, curdled gray, like spoiled milk under the gallery's harsh halogen lights. Her eyes, once wide with calculated innocence, darted frantically, the pupils shrinking to pinpricks of terror as she realized the cameras weren't filming a highlight reel, but a documentary of her demise. A vein in her temple began to throb, a rhythmic, frantic pulsing that betrayed the composure she was trying to scream back into existence. Her mouth hung open, her perfectly lined lips trembling and slick with a sudden, unglamorous sweat that caused her heavy mascara to bleed into the fine lines of her eyes, making her look less like an influencer and more like a cornered animal, realizing the cage had no door. Marcus Thorne took a step toward his younger daughter, his hands trembling so violently that the champagne flute he held finally shattered against the marble floor. The sound seemed to break the spell of the room. He didn't look at the daughter he had spent a lifetime favoring. He looked at the detective, then at the screens displaying the evidence of his own insolvency. His shoulders, usually squared with the unearned pride of a patriarch, slumped until he looked like a hollowed-out version of the man Elena had once feared. Beside him, Clara Thorne was a statue of silk and pearls. Her eyes were fixed on Elena through the glass, filled with a sudden, terrifying clarity. She didn't move to help Sienna. She didn't comfort Marcus. She simply watched the daughter she had ignored for a decade, her hand rising to cover a mouth that had remained silent during every one of Sienna's cruelties. Elena felt a presence beside her. Julian Vane stepped up to the curb, his long wool coat casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the flickering neon of the street. He didn't say a word, merely offered his arm. His silence was the ultimate validation, the sound of a partner who knew the work was done. "She's trying to tell them the signatures are forged," Julian said softly, glancing at the chaos inside. Elena pulled her phone from her clutch. With a single tap, she sent the final file to Detective Miller's tablet. "Let her try. The digital trail starts in her bedroom and ends in the offshore accounts she thought I didn't know about. Arrogance always leaves a footprint." The glass doors swung open, and the sound of the gallery spilled onto the street, a cacophony of shouting, sobbing, and the sharp, rhythmic snap of handcuffs. Sienna was being led toward the exit, her arms pinned behind her back. When she saw Elena standing under the street lamp, she stopped, her heels skidding on the pavement. "You did this!" Sienna shrieked, her voice cracking into a raw, guttural sound. "You're a parasite, Elena. You had nothing, so you had to steal mine. Dad, tell them she's lying." Marcus stepped out behind her, flanked by 2 officers. He looked at Elena, his eyes wet and searching. "Elena, please," he rasped, his voice stripped of its usual booming authority. "Think about what you're doing. We're family. This is a public execution. You're destroying the Thorne name." Elena stepped forward, her shadow stretching across the sidewalk until it touched his polished shoes. The smell of his expensive cologne, something she used to associate with safety, now smelled like nothing but rot. "The Thorne name isn't a legacy, Marcus," she said, her voice a calm, steady blade that cut through the sirens. "It's a debt, and I just settled the account." She turned to Sienna, whose face was a distorted mask of hate and ruined makeup. "You told me once that I didn't belong in this world because I didn't have the stomach for what it takes to stay on top. You were right. I don't want to be on top of this. I want to be the one who burns it down." The board members, people who had laughed at Sienna's jokes while Elena sat at the children's table, were already moving toward the back exits, their faces turned away, their loyalty evaporating the moment the money did. One by one, they pulled out their phones, already distancing themselves from the Thorne brand before the first news cycle could hit. Elena didn't wait to see the car door close on her sister. She didn't wait for the final pleas from a father who only saw her value when his own was gone. She turned her back on the flashing lights and the shattered glass, stepping into the car Julian held open for her. As the door clicked shut, the silence of the interior was absolute. "Where to?" Julian asked, his eyes catching hers in the rearview mirror. Elena looked out the window as the gallery faded into a blur of red and blue. "Somewhere quiet," she said, her fingers finally relaxing against the leather seat. "Somewhere the name Thorne doesn't mean a thing." 6 months had passed since the night the Thorne name became a warning rather than a title. The dust had finally settled, not with a bang, but with the quiet, rhythmic scrape of a palette knife against a canvas in a studio that smelled of linseed oil and expensive silence. Elena Thorne stood before a tattered 17th-century landscape, her hands steady, her mind no longer crowded by the frantic noise of her sister's demands. This space, tucked away in a revitalized industrial district, didn't bear the family crest. It was simply the archive, and for the first time in her life, the air she breathed felt entirely her own. The heavy steel door at the end of the hall gave a muffled thud, followed by the familiar, confident stride of Julian Vane. He didn't knock, he didn't need to. He stopped a few feet away, leaning against a mahogany work table, watching her work. He looked different without the high-tension glare of the gallery lights, more relaxed, though his tailored suit still whispered of the power he wielded. "The final auction for the estate closed this morning," Julian said, his voice low and steady. He pulled a slim tablet from his jacket, sliding a digital file across the table toward her. "The penthouse, the cars, even the summer house in Maine. It's all gone. The creditors were thorough, but Detective Miller was faster. He made sure the restitution for the forged certificates was carved out before the banks could sink their teeth in." Elena didn't look up from the painting immediately. She carefully dabbed a microscopic amount of solvent onto a cotton swab. "And the family?" she asked, her voice devoid of the bitterness that had once defined it. Julian sighed, a sound of weary satisfaction. "Marcus is living in a 2-bedroom rental in the suburbs. He spends his days calling old friends who suddenly can't remember his name. He's still trying to pitch a new consultancy firm, but word travels fast in this circle. A Thorne signature is currently worth less than the paper it's written on." He paused, scrolling through a news feed. "And Sienna Thorne, well, she's had a bit of a career change." He turned the screen toward her. It was a grainy photo taken by a passerby. Sienna was standing behind a counter at a high-end department store, the very one where she used to demand private fittings and champagne service. Her designer highlights were overgrown, and the sharp, arrogant tilt of her chin had been replaced by a look of hollow, simmering resentment. She was folding a pile of cashmere sweaters while a customer pointed dismissively at a stray thread. The irony wasn't lost on Elena. She remembered Sienna once screaming at a waitress for serving her sparkling water at the wrong temperature, claiming that people of her caliber shouldn't have to wait for excellence. Now, she was the one waiting on the very people she used to mock. The face slap hadn't ended at the gallery. It was a slow, daily burn of public service and anonymity. "She tried to file for a name change last week," Julian added, tapping the table. "Claimed she was being harassed. The judge denied it. He told her that if she wanted a new reputation, she'd have to earn it the hard way. Elena finally set her tools down, the silver handle of the palette knife cool against her palm. She walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. She had won. She had the money, the career, and the absolute vindication of seeing the truth laid bare. But as she looked at the empty chair in the corner of her studio, she felt the weight of the cost. Clara Thorne had reached out once, a month ago. The voicemail had been a shaky, tearful mess of apologies and excuses, a mother realizing too late that she had traded her loyal daughter for a polished lie. Elena hadn't called back. The betrayal went too deep. The years of being the invisible one, while Sienna was polished like a trophy, couldn't be undone by a single late-night realization. "You're quiet," Julian observed, moving to stand beside her. "It's just strange," she murmured, her gaze fixed on a distant bridge. "I spent so long wanting them to see me. Now that they finally do, I find I don't really care to look back at them." She turned away from the window and walked back to her desk. Resting, there was a new set of legal documents Julian had brought. She picked up a heavy fountain pen, the weight of it familiar and grounding. At the bottom of the final page, where the signature line waited, she hesitated for only a second. She didn't sign the name that had been dragged through the mud of her father's greed and her sister's vanity. She signed with a sharp, clean script that marked the beginning of something else entirely. As the ink dried, the silence of the studio felt less like a void and more like a foundation. The Thorne legacy was dead, but for the first time, Elena was finally alive. She closed the folder with a definitive snap, the sound echoing through the room like the closing of a vault. "What's next?" she asked, and for the first time, the question didn't feel like a threat.
I hope you enjoyed this wild story. Don't forget to subscribe for more. See you in the next one.